All right, team, I have 9% battery on this thing, so let's go. I forgot to charge it. Eric's like, yes! 20-minute message. Probably not. All right, so last time I spoke prior to the holy days, it was the spring holy days, and I gave a bit of a primer for I'm trying to find my notes. I gave a bit of a primer that led up to the holy days, and I gave it from a bit of a perspective that I hadn't really considered before. I really do. I think it was something that the Lord gave me while I was, oh boy. Need some internet up here, I guess. Okay, here we are. When I was preparing the message during the spring holy days, there was something that it felt like the Lord gave me during the preparations, because I had not considered this prior. It was something that was given to me from a different point of view or perspective, and I really, I didn't want that just to languish in one message. So to some of you all, bear with me, those of you who have heard this before maybe, it's going to go through some analogies to make the point. But it was too much, I think, to constrain to one message, because when God gives you a good point, I'm gonna keep shouting it. So if you'll permit me, I want to dust this off. I want to go through it again, and for some of you, of course, this may be a review. This is so Eric talked a little bit about the holy days last week, the fall holy days, and he asked, I think those who are here who have kept the feast with us before, but not everyone was here. There's a lot of people traveling. So by show of hands, who has kept the Feast of Tabernacles before? It's easier, I'm sorry. Hands down. I asked that wrong. Who hasn't kept the Feast of Tabernacles before? Let's do that. That might be a little bit easier. Okay. That's fine. Great. And so we are coming up on that season, and I wanted you all to understand, to get a bit of a kind of a very high level view. So this is not going to be one of those theologically deep dive messages regarding the meanings behind, Feast of Trumpets, Feast of Atonement, Feast of Tabernacles, 8th day. What we want to do is kind of give a higher level perspective to make the case that these are very germane and relevant to us, yes, even today. So I would say it's supplemental to last week's message in that regard. But before we get into that, there's something we need to understand about God's abilities. I think we all know this about him, but let's turn to the scripture to actually let it say what it says about this aspect of God's nature that he possesses and that we do not. Isaiah 46, verse 9 is where we'll begin. He says, talking to him in the context of this chapter is he's talking about dead idols and the living God. So he's sort of revealing aspects of his character here in contrast to the dead nature of idols. And he says, remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me. And here's the part of his character that we know from this. Declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times, things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all of my pleasure. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man who executes my counsel from a far country. Indeed, I have spoken it, and I will also bring it to pass. I have purposed it, and I also will do it. Our God is so great that he exists outside of space and time. If it takes him... it's nothing to him to see like the span of all known human history. That's a blip to him, right? It says elsewhere in the Bible that 1,000 years is as a day to him. I think Peter gives us that little nugget of information about him. You could extrapolate that out and say 10,000 years is as a day. What's 1,000 years? I mean, we don't want to take that too literally. We don't want to say 10,000 years is 10 days, but at least for the purposes of this message. But 1,000 years is a day. Time is almost immaterial to God. It's something that we as humans are absolutely subject to, though. We can't get away from it, and we all know that. But with that as kind of the foundational base, I want to pose this hypothetical to you. If you were a being such as the Lord and had eternity in the ability to know the end from the beginning, to be able to know the future, the ability to understand, this is my creation, they're going to do this, I'm going to do this in response, they're going to do this in response, I'm going to do that in response, they're going to do this in response. If you're able to just tell all that, and if there's something that's special to you, and if there's something that you wanted the people to know that was just something that was of immense importance and just something you held very close to your and near and dear to your heart, how would you share that good news with someone on the mortal plane if you were eternal and able to comprehend all that? You see the end from the beginning. How do you package that knowledge in a way so your loved ones on earth could grasp and contemplate it? We'll talk about the different ways we could do that maybe, but imagine you had those abilities for a minute. The first thing we need to do is you would need to set up the times of their occurrence. If you want to celebrate something for someone, like we celebrate a person's birthday is only celebrated annually, right? We celebrate holidays. If there's holidays we celebrate those annually. They happen once a year. And so you would set up these times that you would want to commemorate and celebrate. But because you're God, you wouldn't use a piece of paper. You wouldn't use a simple calendar. No, you would go to nature and encode it in very nature itself, right? So Eric talked last week a little bit about the moed. Those are the appointed times of God. If we go all the way back to Genesis 1, in verse 14, God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. Signs here means signals. The seasons is moed. There's a lot of things on that, but definitions. But one of the main ones we see is appointed time. It's a sign or time, a place of solemn assembly, congregation. From the beginning of time, God has set up this calendar to alert, to notify, to keep it in the ethereal, universal matrix. He has put things up there that show us and indicate to us here on earth, those who he loves, the calendar of the celebrations of the things that are special to him. So the first thing you do is you set up a calendar. And you'd say, appointed for what? Maybe you'd say that. Well, good thing, glad you asked. We're going to talk about that a little bit. So let's take the hypothetical a little bit further. When you first meet somebody, what's one of the first things you ask somebody when you meet them? Besides, hi, how are you doing? Like, what's one of the next topics of conversation it usually turns to?
Where are you from?
Yeah, where are you from is a good one. What's your political affiliation and ideologies, and what's your religious stance on it? No. What's the next logical thing? What do you do for a living? Yes. Do we really care how they make money? Or are we more interested in what it is that they do with their hands, with their knowledge, with their time, with the talents that God's given them? That's of immense interest to us as humans, is it not? Because it's how we devote ourselves. As humans, we devote ourselves to purposes. And so if you ask someone, what do you do for a living? You're not asking them how much money do you make, or like what's your financial status. You're asking, what's important to you? Right? You're saying, what's important to you? One of the things that's really important to God is what's going on down here. So if you back off from a 30 or 40,000 foot view, and let's just go to, say, a heaven level view, it's not any more complicated than this. God has planted a crop on the earth that he has harvested from and continues to harvest from. God has planted other crops that he will harvest later. God is a farmer. I hope I didn't say this last time. I don't want to wear this one out, but God's the OG. He's the original gardener, right? So he is the one who has planted. He's the one who harvests. He is the one who uses the earth as he has created it as a garden bed for the children that he is raising. You and I are the crops. Humans are the crops. This is not an unknown concept, right? Jesus himself said that in Matthew 9:37, he said to his disciples, "The harvest is truly plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." And if you fast forward into Revelation 14, we're talking about sort of end times, which is represented by a feast. We'll talk about that later. But Revelation 14 and 15, he says, "Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and on the cloud sat one like the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him and who sat on the cloud, and said, 'Thrust in your sickle and reap, for the time has come for you to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe.'" This is the representing of the late harvest. We'll talk about that more. But it's a harvest nonetheless. So if you were to ask God, what's your job? He'd say probably, well, I'm a gardener. I kind of keep all things together. I keep things going in the garden. I keep things going in the farm. If the farm is the planet, right? Or the entire universe. But his job is, and the thing that's the most important, I would say to him, and I'm sure there's many things that are important to him, but one of the things that's most important to him is how he spends his time, his resources, the things that are important to him, the things that he loves. He pours it in to curating a home for us, to rescuing us, to saving us, to seeing to it that we have food to eat, shelter, clothes, friends. All the aspects of human life is set and dictated by this one we serve and worship, who is the great farmer. So he's growing crops. And further, he's created it in our hearts. When he created us, he kind of created us in his image, right? And so he's made us into these little versions of himself, in a sense, that walk around on this garden and also are charged with tending and keeping it. And so he's put into our hearts, at least early on, we've certainly gotten away from that as a society. I probably talk on that every other sermon, that somehow we've gotten away from agriculture. So we lose so much of the sense of the analogies that are in the word. But he's placed that on our hearts. And actually, from the garden, he said that has been our instruction, is to take and to tend and to keep and to curate that of his creation. And so, if it's important to him, it's important to us. He's put it in our hearts, this notion of gardening. But how would you want people to, if we're talking about things, celebrating things that are important to you, they're yet to come, and if you're really, you're kind of talking about what's really important to God, why don't we just merge those things together? Why don't we merge them together, and we will celebrate the festivals of harvest, be it on a spiritual plane or on a physical plane. If you're a human, man, if you bring in the harvest, that's a time of great rest, a time of joy, a time of, whew, I got it before the weather and the bugs got it. Right? As we drive around, we see these farm fields. I don't know if you've noticed, but the corn this year, the corn last year, it's just as dry and as crisp can be. There is no corn. It's just that the stalk is completely dry. And so harvest time is a time of rejoicing. He said, I beat out all the elements. Me with God's help, if you're an honest farmer, me with God's help. He said, I beat out all the elements. This is a time to rejoice. It's a time to take in the things that we, in partnership with God, we're able to grow. And it's the same thing for the fall harvest. It's a different crop than the spring harvest, but you'd say, we rejoice in the plenty. Have you gone from probably, I would assume, using what's left from the spring, and all of a sudden now you have a lot from the harvest of the fields that we can rejoice in and celebrate. So God says, let's take what's important to me and what's important to you as humans who need food to grow, and so you obviously are harvests are important to you. They're part of the cyclical timekeeping. He says, let's build celebrations around that. So if you ever wondered why these are harvest festivals, I think we're maybe on to it here just a little bit. Now, we've established if there's a time that's important to you, we've set up the calendar. You've established kind of what's important to God, the overall picture of what it is he's doing here on earth. He's put that. And he's had you go through the motions of harvest and planting, all the seasonal variabilities that go through that. And he's had you go through that, so it's getting into your memory. And now he's associating something that's special with him with the thing that you're going through physically, okay? So from there, we would ask, well, okay, what if there was something, a person you wanted to celebrate? If you're God and you know the end from the beginning, and there's a person that's out in the distance that's really important to you that you know about. I say a person that's in the distance. A person who will be coming to earth, who is extremely important to you as God the Father. Would you wait to celebrate that person? And furthermore, if you have those you love on the earth, would you want to wait to share that awesome celebration with them? Let's say you're God. You know that you have a very important thing coming up. And would you want to do it? So the question becomes then is this, if you have people on earth, which he does, which when God rolled these out, he had his chosen people. God always has his chosen people. At the time of the Old Testament, it just happened to be the Israelites. Now, Israel is still extremely important to him, but he has another chosen people that has been grafted in today as well, in the form of the church. If you wanted these early Israelites, when he first rolled these out through Revelation, if you wanted them to celebrate what you had yet to come, and you didn't want to quite tell them yet, this is what's coming in the future, then how would you do it? Let's use an example for this. Let's say you were you're trying to explain to someone in say the Jamestown colonies of America. So Revolutionary War, pre-Constitutional Convention, pre-independence, all that stuff. You're trying to explain to someone that we're going to have a thing called President's Day, and there's going to be actually commemorating George Washington's birthday. And so how would you explain that to them? Because they don't know who George Washington is, or they may, because he's just some rural farmer in Virginia at that time. They don't know who he is. They don't know what a president is, because the king still rules over them. How would you relate this thing? It's things afar off that are yet unknown. You can see them because you have the vision, you have understanding of time in from the beginning. How do you communicate that to the people in the here and now? And I would propose that what you would do is you would use symbols, right? So first thing is, hey, close your banks. The way we're going to celebrate is close all your banks. You can't get your money today, right? No money lending. And I don't know, eat cherry pie. Because I guess I read today somewhere that that's how some people celebrate President's Day. I didn't know that. And it's cherry pie because of, the cherry tree. So I thought I'd take that a step further. Why? Let's put a cherry tree in our living room and set it up and put decorations on it or something. And then we all sing carols about, I cannot tell I did not cut down this tree. Stuff like that. That's how I'd celebrate George Washington, or get people to do that. And then when they actually saw that come to pass, they'd be like, oh, that's what that was all about. I get it now. At the time, it maybe felt like busy work, or like some sort of thing I couldn't quite see because it was afar off. But now I'm starting to see that this was pertaining to George Washington, and that boat on the table with the guy going like this on it as they crossed the Delaware. I didn't know what that was about, but now I get it. Or you could decorate your tables with wooden dentures and teeth. I could just go, I don't know, another 5 minutes like this. But you would have them perform tasks to commemorate and be symbolic of what they understood in their present time, right? And yet it also pointed to something to come. This is what God is doing, in a sense, with the harvest. He's saying, hey, at the end of the harvest, I'm asking you to have a harvest festival. And throughout these celebrations as well, I'm going to be pointing to one who's extremely important to me. So I'm asking you to celebrate them in ways that maybe you don't currently understand. Atonement, you're going to have a lot to do with a high priest. You're going to have something to do with goats and their sacrifices. And we can go back a little bit to the spring feast. We'll talk about that, I guess, maybe a little bit, but we want to focus here on the fall ones, in the fall season, so correlating to the late harvest. So if the spring feast correlated to the spring harvest, at the time of Israel, those were things that had not yet come to pass. But they have come to pass. If Passover represents our Passover lamb in the form of Jesus, if first fruits represents his resurrection, through which there can be no other resurrection for us if there's no resurrection of Jesus. Is it represents Pentecost. Well, days of unleavened bread. So Jesus our unleavened bread, the thing that we take in of him. We get out the leaven of sin, we put that out, and we take in Jesus, our righteousness, through the unleavened bread of righteousness. It's all symbolic. It's got these physical practices attached to it, but it's all pointing afar off to one who represents these things. And you come to Pentecost, where it's Jesus, the provider of the Holy Spirit. At the time of Israel, it was like it was essentially a convocation. But isn't it cool that there was like a gathering there, a central gathering that pointed afar off to a time in the future where there would be a gathering with a very unique thing that happened on that day in the form of the Holy Spirit coming down in tongues of fire on the believers who are there. So you have all these things that point forward. Now consider, let's say, a historical occasion. You could say 4th of July. Let's go through that same thing again. If I were to try to not just demonstrate a person, like in the form of George Washington, but if I were to try to demonstrate an entire formation of a country with freedom and independence and all that to someone who, again, was in the Jamestown colonies, they wouldn't know what that's about. I'd say, okay, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to celebrate with red, white, and blue stuff. Make your colors red, white, and blue. And they'd say, oh, okay. Again, this is if you knew the end from the beginning and they didn't know a thing about what was happening yet. You'd say, we're going to celebrate freedom from some tyrant. We're going to have something to do with tea because of something yet to happen. You don't know that yet, but have tea decorations. Have a tall, lanky guy with a beard on stilts. And there's indications, and it's an overall theme of war, explosions, so forth going off. What's all that about? Well, we don't know yet, but we'll do it, and then we'll come to know that it represents something. This is the same thing that God is doing through his holy days. He's pointing to stuff that we don't have afar off. I want one more. I'm going to go through Thanksgiving. I think you all get the point, but I'm going to go through Thanksgiving. If you're trying to explain to the 1500s and 1600s pilgrims who are still in England, still under religious persecution, be like, hey, look, there's something that's going to happen to you. We want you to celebrate it before you even get there. How would you do it? You'd say, hey, look, we eat turkey. We come together in a convocation. We express gratitude. You dress your kids up like with moccasins and a feather in their hair or something. Or you eagerly anticipate the coming of Elvis. You guys don't do that? Is that that's just a Glasgow thing? I guess it's just a Glasgow thing. So I don't know how it happened, but at some juncture in our family celebrations of Thanksgiving, 1970s era big Elvis with the jumpsuit showed up at our thing, and it was everyone just couldn't believe it, and it was one of our family members in a costume, and I guess it was born as a tradition, and there you have it. This is how we celebrate, and that's someone maybe a little bit. This is what Thanksgiving looks like at our house. Eric went kicking and screaming into this one, by the way. The other thing is you never know who it's going to be. It's decided by like the secretive unselect committee of who we all kind of like confirmed, like, who's it going to be this year? And did you bring the costume? Yeah, I brought the costume. So this last year it got conferred on me and Liz. And so this is how we do it. This is how God does it. Just like this, right? Just like this. But a little different, I guess you could say, a little bit differently. You embed symbology in it so that when it comes to pass, it's understood for what it is. Again, I don't know what the correlation is between Elvis and Thanksgiving. There really is none. But if you're 1,500 years before the coming of Messiah, you go through these things. God is doing these things in a sense. He's picking things that are important to people in their lives and having them go through the routine and the action of it, in a sense, to get them in the muscle memory of it. God knows we're forgetful, right? He knows we're so forgetful. And so he puts us through exercises that keep things on the top of our minds. Like Passover, right? Let's just use this as an example. Passover, they took a lamb. They sacrificed a lamb. They put the blood on the doorposts. They put the blood on the wood. And this, they'll say, then they had unleavened bread, which we already talked about a little bit, but the blood, the lamb, of course, it goes on to be Jesus. And that would be maybe a little coincidental, except for the fact that he was the lamb whose blood was spread on the wood of the cross on the same day at the same time the unblemished lamb of the Passover would have been slaughtered. And he was the blood on the wood post that kept death from, allowed death to pass us over, just as it did Israel. And so you see the fulfillment of these things come out, as Eric was pointing out last week, you see the fulfillment of these coming out in the person and figure of Jesus. So if the Lord wanted to celebrate what he would be doing through his son at times of harvest, both in order to make the harvest even possible, the Lord of harvest would embed all of these things into the calendar of the things and the days that are special to him, and then ask those who don't quite understand it yet to go through them. Now what's interesting is that Israel saw these things dimly and darkly because none of these things had yet come to pass, right? So the Passover in its full fulfillment had not yet come to pass. Unleavened bread in its full fulfillment had not yet come to pass. First fruits had certainly not yet come to pass. Pentecost had not yet come to pass in its fullness. But we see through this study of this word, that it has come to pass. These four have come to pass. The beautiful thing and unique thing about the fall feasts that we are coming up on is they are things that have not yet come to pass and the things we look forward to eagerly. Now, some might say, well, we don't need to celebrate the spring feasting longer because Jesus fulfilled them. He filled up the meaning in them. They have come to pass. He certainly has. He became the flesh incarnation of what these things were pointing to, but they still hold relevance. And there's a reason for that. It says in, I'm going to fast forward a little bit in my notes here. There is a time after all the things that the fall festivals point to. And we'll get into the fall festivals in a minute, but just say for now, all the things that the fall festivals point to, the events that are yet to come, even after all those happen, in Zechariah 14 it says, and it shall come to pass, the context of this is that all these things, it's a future prophecy, all these things have come to pass. In Zechariah 14:16 it says, and it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem at Armageddon shall go up from year to year to worship the King, Yahweh of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be that whoever the families of the earth does not come up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, on them there will be no rain. And they go on to say that the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations that don't come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles will be no rain, no harvest. It's interesting that it's going back to harvest. They will not have harvest because they're not celebrating the harvest festivals. Well, what's interesting about that time and place is that they're not celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles and essentially the time that the Feast of Tabernacles represents. So if we're going to argue that maybe the fulfillment it's already taken place or that Jesus has fulfilled them, this actually gives you something to ponder and consider perhaps to say, well, if Jesus has already returned and all this has come to pass and we're still celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles, at that point they may become something of commemoration, just like the Passover is a thing of commemoration, but we still do it to remind us of what it is that he has done for us on our behalf, that we would not forget that. It's the same reason we talk about the gospel so often, right? If we don't remind ourselves that we came from nothing, we were dirt, we were sinful dirt at that, but we were sinful dirt that God loved and lifted up and had mercy on and gave us a way through his son who was so opposite of dirt. He was spirit who came down and became dirt like us and lived a life that was so perfect so that he could take our sin on our behalf so that we could have eternal life with him when we accept him. If we don't remind ourselves of that simple principles of the gospel, we might soon begin to delve off into deep things that where we pat ourselves on the back for being so holy and righteous. It's the revisiting of the gospel that reminds us why we're not so special and so righteous. It reminds us why we do need him every single day. And so it is as well with the holy days. The gospel is embedded in that. All right. So here we are on the why. If you haven't figured it out yet, Jesus is the inflection point of history. And if you know the end from the beginning, and you know what the inflection point of history is, and you know who your son is, and you know what your son's going to do for you, I propose to you, at least if it were me, I'm not going to wait to celebrate that. I'm going to celebrate it with the people I love, when I have the people I love, my chosen people, and I'm going to show them a way how to do it so that it makes sense to them in some way, shape, or form. And then I'm going to give them a deeper meaning once my son has come. All right, so just real quick, if you haven't kept the feasts with us before, what we have coming up, the Feast of Trumpets. The Feast of Trumpets is an amazing day. Scott from Rock Valley will be here next week to talk on trumpets, and he'll go deeper into the meaning of the day itself. But the meaning of the day is really self-evident. So you see that it's really not a lot of instruction given on it besides there shall be a blowing of trumpets and a shout that goes up with it. You see that elsewhere in the Bible, but most prominently you see that in the Bible. You see that in the Bible at Christ's return, the sounding of trumpets, his return, a great shout going forth, presumably from his people, a great shout going forth of fear from those who are not his people. It's going to be a day of triumph, a day of judgment. Well, maybe not the full judgment, but it's a day of triumph, certainly a day of a type of judgment for them on that day who are not the Lord's. But it will be an amazing day. So we celebrate that, and then we come to atonement. Christ having returned and having taken up all of his chosen ones, his saints, to rule with him, he now presides over the governments of the earth. Those who have lasted through the day of trumpets, those on the earth who lasted through that shall now be on earth, and Jesus will be reigning over them. I can't wait for a government that actually works. That will be something we're not used to. Really, no people in much of history has been used to that. But he will be over that, and there will be a reconciling of him to those who are left on the earth. And it's represented, I guess, through fasting, because we are showing how much we need him, how much humanity needs God through this. Remember, when you deprive yourself of food, you are essentially lowering yourself, humbling yourself, giving yourself something that God can work with. So if there's fasting on atonement, if there's allusions, actually not allusions, it's very vivid in the Bible that it talks about the high priest. There's a lot of instructions about pertaining to the high priest and focus on the high priest as well as the sacrifice. Then this time represents the time that our high priest, our king, will be reigning on the earth. That those we will be reigning with him as those who are his chosen, if we overcome. And that those who live over into this time, they will be presumably humbling themselves in order to come under the dominion and leadership of the Lord. And you have the Feast of Tabernacles. This is the time of harvest. I may have just confused atonement with tabernacles. Forgive me if I did that. But tabernacles is the time where Jesus reigns over everything. It's a time of judgment. It's a time of separating the sheep from the goats. And of course, that is capped by the 8th day, which is where Jesus turns over all things back to the Father, the Bible says. And again, we will talk about these in greater detail as we go through them. We're about to go through 8 days of discussions on this, so I don't want to start giving sermons on the Feast of Tabernacles while I'm here today. But I wanted to give us just kind of a primer, saying this is what's coming up, so we won't just kind of just stumble into the feasts. There's a really great book that we have on our website. I just put up the banner. So if you go to oakstone.co right now or later, on the front page there's a banner that pops up that takes you to I think it's like a 30-page booklet on celebrating the feasts of the Lord. This gives you a really good breakdown of how each feast pertains to the purposes and projects of God's plan. And it tells you what they represent according to the Bible. So I just want to encourage you guys that this is not legalism. We can certainly celebrate these from a legalistic perspective if we choose to. If we take the Old Testament and we celebrate things to the letter, by the letter, then we could certainly go down that road. However, the right way to celebrate the feast is in spirit and in truth. So I would invite each of you, as we study for these feasts coming into them, as we look into what they mean, to look into what is the spiritual purpose behind this thing we're doing. Eric talked last week about finding the purposes behind the parapet. I don't have a roof I hang out, but I have a porch right now that is in violation of that law. So don't come over and fall off my porch, okay? But the idea is caring for people, right? So in this, if we're looking for each thing, if we're looking through each feast, we're saying, how does this pertain and point to Jesus? How does it pertain and point to the harvest that God is working out on this planet at this time? And how is it He wants us to come through and celebrate this? If we want to build a sukkah, great. But let that not be something that we consider a mandate or a requirement in order to worship God, because God has said through Jesus, when Jesus was on earth, that, look, there's coming a time, and now is, when you don't have to go up to a place or do a thing in order to worship me. You can worship me where you need to worship me. That's a really bad paraphrase. I think I have it in here. Let me just read it real quick. The hour is coming and now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. And he was answering the woman at the well's question. He said, must I go up to this mountain to worship you? Right? So if we were to observe these feasts and letter, we'd all be going to Jerusalem. We're not. We're here in Denton, Texas this year. Some of us are going elsewhere, and that's fine. But we want to keep these in spirit and truth. And I want to just point this out. When we say we're doing something in spirit, that doesn't mean just that we just like intellectually assent to it. Right? So say, yeah, I read it. I agree with that. That's not worshiping in the spirit, just intellectually agreeing with something. It requires an acting out of that agreement. Worshiping in the spirit means agreeing with the holy days and getting action involved. Same as if you say you love someone, you can say it and then do things that play out differently that would demonstrate that you don't necessarily love someone. So if we say we worship in spirit and truth, I think the question is, what is the spirit of this? And then how do we act that out? So I want to encourage everyone to just be looking into this, to be studying into this. If you don't keep the holy days right now, that's fine. Just be praying about it. I think my personal belief is that they are days that are extraordinarily special to God, and so they're special to me too. I think that's the place we want to come at it, not that we keep these for our salvation, right? And so when we look at it from those terms, I hope that gives you something to look into and to find what it is that God has known from the beginning of time and has embedded into each of these days. To find that out, God says it's a matter for him to conceal things in his word, and it's the glory of kings and of people and men to search it out. So I encourage you to search out what is the meaning behind these holy days as we come on to celebrate them. Let's go ahead and worship him right now, and then we'll go over to the potluck hall and continue our fellowship.